Daphne Oseña-Paez. And this afternoon, we have a special interview with Amit Prothi. Let me introduce him. Amit Prothi is the Director General of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Mr. Prothi brings a wealth of international experience and expertise on climate and disaster resilience issues. He's had 25 years of progressive leadership and experience in the fields of urban planning and resilient infrastructure, with experience across more than 15 countries in North America, Asia, and Europe. And today, hopefully, we'll be talking about some of the topics that you touch on related to climate change mitigation, adaptation, environmental planning, urban policy, land use and transportation planning, natural resource management, flood management, disaster resilient infrastructure, housing and community development. Mr. Prothi, that's a lot of experience in the field, but I had the pleasure of listening to you yesterday at the talk. Let's start with, please tell us about CDRI.
Sure. First of all, Ms. Daphne, thank you for having me. I lead a coalition. It's called the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. It was established, it was announced in 2019 by the Honorable Prime Minister of India to essentially to show leadership to the world, saying we need new solutions to problems that are unique to emerging countries. So it's a coalition. It's a coalition now that has 47 members who have joined, including 40 countries. The agenda is very clear. It's like we need to focus on building and rebuilding and upgrading infrastructure in a way that doesn't get damaged during a disaster. We see time and again a cyclone comes or an earthquake comes and we lose infrastructure. So what do we do about making sure that when we're building infrastructure, we're not losing it, we're not, the services are not disrupted, etc. So it's a very young coalition, less than 5 years old. And we continue to add members every year. We continue to add, we're getting resources from governments to do this work. We are an international organization now recognized by Government of India, and other governments are also starting to give us that, that designation of an international organization. So we're an international organization headquartered in Delhi, led by India, but now with 40 countries that are members.
Mm-hmm. What are the benefits of being in a coalition?
So, what's interesting is, as you notice, that I've been working in this field for a long time. And what you realize is that, different countries are actually innovating a lot when it comes to looking at climate change, looking at disasters. This could be new building codes. This could be new ways of financing, things like insurance mechanisms, etc. So the idea of a coalition is, one, can we learn from each other? What Philippines may have done very well, particularly around community resilience, could be something that could resonate very well in other parts of the world. So how does Philippines, through the coalition, share with others what they're doing? Similarly, there are countries that are asking for, new ways of doing things. Sometimes it's about, new training for engineers, new training for their social scientists, new policy frameworks. So they reach out and say, how do we do this? And the coalition becomes a vehicle for providing connecting the dots between different things that are going on in different parts of the world, but also then spurring, we also understand what are the new demands from countries. Wind speeds are changing, for example. So how do you, plan for new wind speeds when you're building your power infrastructure? You've got now this whole notion of AI coming into, we're all talking about AI. How can we use that for a public good where we can understand our risks better, faster, so we can have predictive ways of addressing risks? Because the computing power is there today, but the solutions aren't. So how do we spur some of that work? So it's about really sort of sharing, identifying opportunities that are new, putting brains together of different, expertise from different countries to solve problems that are also getting more and more complex.
You mentioned the importance of sharing data and information. And yesterday you also said that this data, this information should not be hidden from the public. Why is that?
So, it's, I'll give you the analogy of a household. If you know how much money you have in your budget, you make decisions based on that information. You choose whether I want to do this or that. Risk data is similar. if we can start to understand what are the risks to our communities, risks to our infrastructure, how much we could potentially lose because of a cyclone, flood, heat event, etc. If we know the amount, we can start to say, if I put in a little bit amount here, I can actually reduce what I might lose. So information is power. Unfortunately, right now, most governments don't have the sophisticated modeling understanding, techniques, capacities to actually come out with some of the best methodology that they can come out with that already exists. Private sector, particularly the insurance sectors, is very, very good at it. So we as a coalition said, let's at least put together a risk database for the entire world. We've done that. It's actually in the public domain. It's a starting point for countries that may or may not have that information to say, okay, how do I understand when I look at my power sector, look at my telecommunication sector, I look at my transportation sector, where is that risk emanating from? Most people have that information as anecdotal information or information that may be based on one or two events. But through sophisticated modeling, we can actually predict, this is how much you could potentially lose in a year. And because of the extremes of climate change, the variability of climate change, how does that exaggerate your risk? And we've actually put this in the public domain with an intention that, if you're aware, if you're paying attention to it, then you start giving it more attention to on the solution side. You're not still trying to build the evidence.
It was also mentioned that, of course, data is so important, but not all countries have the capacity to generate or collect the data. And it's not the most exciting thing. Everyone already wants solution and discussions, but it has to be science and data-based, right? So where do people begin? Where do countries and companies begin?
So if you're the private sector, there's now in the last 3-4 years, a lot of private sector companies that are building models using satellite information, trying and then marketing that to governments. So essentially, the private sector is already ahead in terms of getting the solutions in terms of the data side. Governments are still catching up. Some governments are very good at it, others are catching up. The opportunity really is, if you're Manila, Metro Manila, and you know that you're going to get cyclones, what is it that you can do that is already beyond what you're already doing? So, how do you learn from others and say, I can't afford to continue to lose my roads to floods every year. What is it that Japan has done? What is it that the Netherlands has done? What is it that India may have done? What is it that Brazil has done? Because flooding is one of those problems that most urban cities are, urban areas are facing, and the extent of flooding is getting worse. So, how do you get those solutions quickly? How do you get to learn from others quickly so that you're not continuously reinventing the wheel? There is now a lot more evidence. If you've got coastal infrastructure, you have because of climate change now, you're seeing a lot more action along the coast, sea waves, sea level rise, coastal erosion, etc. Now, traditionally, you may have been building a sea wall to protect yourself. There's been anecdotal evidence that mangroves can also protect your coastline, right? But where is the research on that? Who has done it? Are there experiments that have worked across countries? So part of the responsibility of a coalition such as ours is to say, seawall may be one of the solutions, but here is another solution that's actually cheaper, that offers you multiple benefits, because if you have a mangrove, there's a greenhouse gas emission to it, there is livelihood opportunities around it, and so and so place has done it. So you're actually, if you're a public official sitting in Metro Manila, you want to know who else has done it before you put your, trust behind something. So part of the responsibility is to see how do we bring these solutions in from one place to another where people are experimenting to address these problems.
Very interesting. Let's go to Asia and the Pacific. What are the challenges and gaps, as well as opportunities, for building disaster-resilient infrastructure?
Sure. So given that we are building a lot of infrastructure, the numbers are something like the amount of infrastructure we will build in the next 20 years is what we have built over the last 200 years, right? And a lot of that infrastructure is going to be built, upgraded in this region. So then how do we, knowing that every year we lose about 4 to 6% of our annual GDP growth because of losses related to disaster. When you aggregate your disaster, the impact from cyclones, floods, heat, all of these events, when you aggregate the amount of losses, the numbers exceed, $800 billion globally. That's the amount of risk we are carrying. Knowing that, knowing we need to invest in infrastructure, how can you make those marginal improvements, which are really the opportunity at this point? Let's say you're building a transmission tower for your telecommunication system, and wind speeds are changing because that's what the predictions are, that wind speeds are changing. Well, what do you need to do today? If you invest that $1 extra, but that allows you to save your tower for an extended period of time, that gives you much more returns than that $1, right? So this is the opportunity to start bringing those kinds of innovations into all kind of infrastructure systems. So we're looking at power sector, we're looking at telecommunication sector, we're also looking at roads, airports, seaports, to try to see what are those marginal improvements you can make so that your understanding of future risk is part of your current estimations. And you can make those marginal improvements so that you're not losing that infrastructure ahead of time.
So it's really disaster risk reduction as an investment.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let's talk about real world samples based on your work. Maybe for urban areas and then island states. Could you give us some key considerations on resilient infrastructure systems?
Sure. I'll give you an example that I often use, which is from the Kathmandu earthquake. You remember 2015, there was a massive earthquake in Kathmandu, and the images were devastating. When you think about the buildings that collapsed, etc. I happened to be in Kathmandu that day. And I happened to be hiking in the hills around Kathmandu, and when the earthquake happened, which lasted for, I think, close to a minute, I was overlooking the valley of Kathmandu. So I was standing, taking photographs, taking videos, and I could see dust clouds rising in the valley. So my imagination was, this is a big earthquake, this city is destroyed. I made it down after 3 hours, and what I found was that 1 out of 6 buildings collapsed, but 5 buildings were standing. And the 5 buildings that were standing were because there was a new building code that was being put in place, and people had invested in upgrading. So even though it was a catastrophic event, the amount of destruction that happened could have been much worse if those building codes were not in place. And to me, that's a good example of resilient infrastructure, resilient buildings, because you've addressed the risk of earthquakes in your building stock. So that's one that comes to mind immediately.
That's interesting. What happens to older buildings that, what can communities and governments do now? There are some very visibly not up to code buildings.
Sure. So, I think first of all, not every building is at the same amount of risk. So one needs to have a much more fine-grained understanding of what might fail in what kind of an event. There are places that will flood. There are places where cyclonic activity will interact with buildings or other infrastructure. There's places where it's earthquake related. So trying to understand all of those different hazards, sometimes it's multiple hazards, and then looking at your, in this case, building stock to say, where are the points of failure? Is it because it floods and you've got all of your electrical equipment on the ground, and the moment it floods, you're losing power, etc. So, often in hospitals we do that. We go and see in hospitals, where is your infrastructure that could, fail during a flood located if that hospital is in a floodplain. Now, when it comes to buildings and earthquakes, it's very hard to upgrade every building to the building code that may be extensive. So then you have to make decisions to say, what is there something bare minimum that I can do, or I can, as a government, provide a subsidy to people who are actually, living in these places to say, can you make some upgrades? Sometimes that's an option, sometimes that's not an option. When that's not an option, and India did this with cyclone activity along the coast of Odisha. They couldn't upgrade all the buildings, but what they did is create shelters so that when there was a cyclone coming, people could at least go to a safe place. The amount of investments required sometimes for resident infrastructure can be so difficult to actually put in place that you have to find other solutions. You have to find solutions where you're not losing lives, where you find solutions where you can make marginal improvements. You make decisions, you prioritize. You know, you prioritize your schools, your hospitals, then other forms of infrastructure. But you have to spend more time, you know. I'll stop there.
It's endless.
It is.
But wow. So speaking of all that, how do you motivate both the public and private sectors to prioritize and then also increase infrastructure resilient investments?
Sure. So with the public sector, the argument we usually make is that, you know, you are already responsible for your roads, you're already responsible for building certain kinds of infrastructure. You know you have investment programs. So how can we as a coalition try to look at your investment portfolio and find the opportunities for upgrade? You know, we're looking at certain infrastructure pipelines at the country level, which are, you know, substantial amount of investments that governments are already planning. And there we are saying, in your cost benefit analysis, if you take into account that you're also locating some of this infrastructure in risk prone areas, well, you can actually do a ABC, and that may give you a different return on your return on investment. We've done this with a coastal state where we've looked at the entire power distribution system along the coast. We've understood how changing wind speeds will affect that infrastructure, and we've then worked with the government to say, you have option A, option B, option C. Option A, you underground everything and it'll cost you this much. Option B, you underground only around critical infrastructure places and that'll cost you so much. Option C, so we mapped out each individual tower and transmission line and distribution system and said, these are the obvious failure points. Well, you can do some things to address these at least in the immediate future, and then this, and then this. So we're helping governments, you know, make better decisions where they're understanding what is more vulnerable than other things. For the private sector, I would say, you know, private sector end of the day is very good at understanding returns. So for them, if there is a way to show, and we are doing that, where if they're investing in a PPP agreement for a road, for example, and we're able to tell them that your road will not give you the same returns that you're expecting. We saw that during COVID. If you think what happened to our metro systems, a lot of companies had taken loans to build metro systems. For 1 or 2 years, there was no usage in that metro system, so you had an impact on your cash flow. Similarly, disasters can affect cash flows. So if you can predict your cash flow and predict what kind of risks are in that from natural hazards, you can make different decisions. So that's where we work with the private sector to make, you know, understand the risk and then prioritize certain investments that can secure the risks for the longer term.
Wow. Now, speaking of risks again, so turning risks into opportunities for investment. You've been here, this is day 2, you've met a lot of our regional and also our national officials. Do you see any opportunities for the Philippines?
Look, I think, you know, I've been working around the world. Philippines actually stands out amongst the country that has understood disasters and understood community resilience much better than most countries. So I heard somebody mention yesterday in a panel that in Philippines we always prioritize community and people first, right? And I think that's, to me, the lesson for everybody else. I'm sitting here and I've been talking for the last 8 minutes, but I have not mentioned people. That's a lesson for me to take away. Infrastructure is actually for people. So getting people involved in upgrading, getting people involved in these decisions, because end of the day it affects their lives, is a lesson that Philippines often offers to the world. To me, that's the opportunity. I can't go beyond that. In 2 days, there's only so much I can hear. But to me, that community perspective, the community, the opportunity for always thinking about people first. What are the most basic needs for people? And how do you make sure that when you're thinking about resilience, you're trying to address those most basic needs first, whether it's water, whether it's energy, so that when there's a hurricane, when there's a disaster, these basic things are always going to be there, no matter what. And that to me is like my lesson from Philippines at least.
Wow, very well said. I also learned from you on that. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for this very informative discussion. And the Philippines is not yet in CDRI.
Not yet.
Yet.
And we're waiting for them to join.
Waiting for them to join.
Yes.
Okay, we look forward to that. I hope for that. I've learned a lot from your organization and from your experience working on infrastructure and investing in disaster risk reduction all over the world. Thank you so much, Mr. Amit Prothi.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Ms. Daphne.